Yes, welcome back. We have an extraordinary um, and very eminent guest today on Exopolitics TV, Dr. Seth Farber. And Dr. Farber is the author of a recent book called The Spiritual Gift of Madness, The Failure of Psychiatry and the Rise of the Mad Pride Movement. Welcome, uh,
Thank you.
Dr. Farber. May I may I call you Seth? Would that be okay?
Yes, please do.
Oh, good. Thank you. Um, your book touches on so many different themes that we cover here at Exopolitics TV, ranging from the transhumanist agenda, where psychiatrists have been recruited as almost gatekeepers to say that people who have been implanted with microchips are hallucinating
Yeah.
the very real controls, to areas which you identify uh, where, for example, quoting Perry, who writes that almost universally within acute psychosis lies a messianic vision of a new world order based on equality and harmony, tolerance and love. And that's the utopia,
Yes.
which not only those progressive voices and visions of people in the multidimensional movement are seeking, but it's very common to multidimensional contactees.
Mm-hmm.
And their contactors often imbue their contactees with the messianic vision.
Mm.
So these are such common themes. Um, and I thought that there's so many strands to unwind here that we could go back to the beginning, and that is a psychiatrist where both of our lives intersect, your life and my life.
Yeah.
I have a degree as a graduate psychotherapist in terms of a counseling degree, and
Yeah.
I did practicum, and then we moved to Canada, and my wife is a PhD psychologist, so she does the psychotherapy in our family, and I do the sort of activism. I haven't practiced. I just did practicum.
Mm-hmm.
But why don't we start this with the politics of experience and R.D. Laing?
Yes.
Because you list him as your mentor, and in many ways, he was my mentor.
Mm.
And tell us about how you came across R.D. Laing's work and how it affected you then and how it's affected you over the years. And tell us a bit about R.D. Laing, because people in our community might not be familiar with him.
Most people aren't anymore. He's
Yeah,
like one of those figures who was an icon in the '60s and is no longer known.
right,
People, I would say, in his day, he was probably as well known as Timothy Leary. Most people today would probably know the name Timothy Leary, but they don't know Lang. I discovered Lang when I was about 16, and I read his second book called The Politics of Experience. And since at that time I was already a radical or revolutionary uh, neo-Marxist, I was a young kid to 16, but I realized there was something wrong with the society in which we live, and he articulated these ideas that were very exciting. And To me, at that time, I had no idea I was going to go into psychology. It was just such a radical critique of society, and it wasn't one of those kind of boring. It didn't. It was a cultural critique. It wasn't just a critique of the maldistribution of income. All of these things are are issues that were rightfully raised by Occupy Wall Street, but Laing went further, and I think that was what appealed to me about him, even at the time at 16. For example, I'll pick a quote here. I think it gives the flavor of the whole book. Later, I connected with him again when I decided to go into psychology, but this was just the effect it had on me as a kind of rebellious 16-year-old who became part of the anti-war movement. I was 16, but I joined NYU SDS, and then later, a couple of years later, I went to University of Wisconsin in Madison, where the anti-war movement in 1970 was still pretty big, thousands of people. Here's, I think, a characteristic quote. And for people who are too young to remember this time, I'll just preface it by saying that the United States was dropping bombs on innocent people, non-combatants, peasants, and the United States was also involved in a nuclear arms race, because you know this, but a 30-year-old might not, with the Soviet Union. And these were things that everybody was aware of at the time. So Laing, one of the quotes from that book, I think I used to quote it all the time when I get in arguments with people who were supporting the war in Vietnam or making excuses. Laing said, the perfectly adjusted bomber pilot may be a greater threat to species survival than the hospitalized schizophrenic deluded that the bomb is inside him. Our society may itself have become biologically dysfunctional, and some forms of schizophrenic alienation from the alienation of our society may have a sociobiological function that we have not yet recognized. I could explain that. I don't know if that was clear.
Oh yes. I mean that here we have the actor of the pilot in a bomber, or the person who's pushing the button, or the person in the White House or in the Kremlin or wherever. Yeah. And they may be perfectly rational, but it's a psychopathic system.
Right.
And so everyone has become a psychopath by serving that psychopathic system. Is that sort of a summary of that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple ideas in there. One of them is that, in fact, to kind of elaborate on what you said, is that the category psychiatry uses, both in terms of the way they're fashioned and the way they're applied, make it seem as if murder and dropping bombs and so on is normative, and that's mentally healthy. Whereas the schizophrenic at that time, and now today, well, now maybe a few people would know to question it, but not very many. Certainly at that time, the idea that schizophrenics might not be mentally ill and that they might be in better shape than the person who's dropping the bombs, not just dropping the bombs, as you point out, that's the person on the kind of lower level of the machine. Mario Savio had spoken about the machine too. It was a kind of common theme then in the 60s, that this machine grinds on relentlessly, murderously, and that the only thing for a person of decency to do is to, as Mario Savio said, throw himself on the wheels of the machine to stop it. And now Laing was coming along and saying that perhaps equally radical, schizophrenia might be a form of rebellion against the machine. And that the people who were part of the machine were seen as mentally ill. I would say, I don't know if Laing sometimes uses this metaphor, the people who did the categorizing, like you're mentally healthy and you're mentally ill, were the priesthood of modern day society, the secular priesthood. And Now, when Laing says that perfectly adjusted, okay, that he speaks of the hospitalized schizophrenic deluded that the bomb is inside him. That's a little bit dated, so I should perhaps explain that reference. There were quite a few people who were labeled schizophrenic, who were schizophrenic by the standards of those times and our times, who would say things like, then, the bomb is inside of me. In fact, Laing had a couple of examples. So in a way, Laing liked to point this out all the time. They were saying, in metaphors, truth about society that nobody was listening to. No one wanted to listen to. And on the other hand, here you have the people who are supposedly the wise people of society, the pundits, the sages, being the psychiatrists and the psychologists who, are supposed to have an insight into the human psyche. And basically they are sanctioning, Laing was saying, what the bombers do and declaring the schizophrenic communications to be symptoms of a disease. As another critic of the mental health system put it, Thomas Szasz, his or her communications to schizophrenics become not taken as communication, no effort made to understand it. They become merely the semantic exudates of the disease process. Laing said at one point, there's a game and that is being played. There's a subtext in family, society. Well, one of the first rules of the game is, and that's if you break this, you're breaking like a critical social taboo. Don't say it's a game. Don't comment on the game itself. Don't make a meta comment. And that's what Laing did. He made a meta comment. And that's why I believe that my book, I often refer to it, my new book, as a neo-Langian book, sort of in a metaphoric sense. Right. But to say, in the same way that Laing did, I am making a meta-comment on society, and why is it considered normative to give orders to drop bombs and all of these things that or even to be presidented to do the kinds of things that presidents do or people in office do. And I take it a step further than Laing, and that Laing, this is the one quote where he says, he throughout the Politics of Experience, a book that, by the way, he retreated from 2 or 3 years after he wrote it. Well, I could go into that later, but he didn't repudiate it, he just retreated to a safer position. But he says that some forms of schizophrenic alienation, calls it alienation from society rather than adjustment, and Martin Luther King spoke of the ideal being the creatively maladjusted individual. And that's a theme in my book, too. So rather than adjustment, Laing says that they may have a sociobiological function that we have not yet recognized. So the question I raise in the book is, what is is there a sociobiological function to schizophrenia, and if so, what is it? So you see, there's a lot in just that one sentence. The common themes are Seeker Society that were done by Ken Kesey, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and the machine that grinds on murderously, and the dropping of bombs, and the violence of society, and the problematic nature of the people, the psychiatric priesthood, who have the nerve, really, to say, well, we know what's right and we know what's healthy, and they disguise it. They disguise their value judgment in the objective mystifications of pseudoscientific, pseudo-medical language. Those were common themes. The uncommon, which I agree with, obviously, the uncommon theme where I think I took it a little bit further was that these people actually have a redemptive role to play in society, a messianic role. And nobody says that. I think right now, I hardly meet even my fellow radicals who are fellow critics of the mental health system I don't meet very many who, I'd have to think, who go and say that, yes, and I've met, people I'm friends with, clients, friends, and comrades in the same organization with, have either got labeled schizophrenic or bipolar, and I believe that they've had, as that quote from John Weir Perry, the psychiatrist you quoted, they've had messianic visions, and those visions are that's what's potentially redemptive about schizophrenia, and that's been noted by other people a long time ago.
Exactly. Now, and we'll be going through this theme as our conversation goes on. Going back to R.D. Laing, and I believe this was in the late 60s or so, my understanding was that he established a community, I believe it was in the UK, and he and fellow psychiatrists lived in that community along with their patients.
Kingsley Hall.
And they were all equal there. Is that correct?
It's called Kingsley Hall. The community was called Kingsley Hall.
Oh, Kingsley Hall. Okay. Could you tell us more about Kingsley Hall?
Well, I'm just pouring myself some water since my
sure.
My throat gets dry.
Yeah, sure.
That was it was a great idea, and it inspired a lot of other communities that were more successful. I think the kind of consensus was that it wasn't as successful as it could have been, not because the idea was wrong, but because Laing was drunk half the time.
Oh.
And, he had a tendency to drink probably what most people would consider excessively.
I see.
And he was functional, but he was, there were things that, this was the 60s, remember, also. So there were certain excesses that happened that made Kingsley Hall, although I saw a movie on Kingsley Hall, and there was one woman whose life was saved by Kingsley Hall. There are two we know of. There's Mary Barnes. We know of her because she wrote a book and it became famous, at least in the 70s. Is her name familiar to you, Mary Barnes?
I'm not familiar of the literature on Kingsley Hall. I have a personal anecdote which I'd like to follow up with later about Kingsley Hall, and so I'm very interested in what you have to tell us about Kingsley Hall.
Her book became famous among people who were not didn't necessarily know about Kingsley Hall, just because she was a schizophrenic who claimed she was cured by painting and the freedom that Kingsley Hall afforded her. I was pretty famous in England. Some famous playwright, David Hare, I think, wrote a play about it that won awards. They made movies. And she then went on as a career as a painter, and she did exhibits, and she wrote a book that was the famous case. The other case was the woman that was in the movie, and you see her, and she's explaining why Kingsley Hall is such a wonderful place. And then I saw this film about 4 years ago. I might have seen it before that. I think it's about a 10-year-old film. Of course, the footage is much older because Laing died in '89. But she's now a psychologist and attributes her recovery from quote-unquote schizophrenia to being at Kingsley Hall. But that said, it should be said, Kingsley Hall didn't have a great success rate because there was so much chaos going on along there. David Cooper was a crazy Maoist psychiatrist who since died. There are a lot of interesting stories. But in America, they had a place that was very successful called Interior House that was set up a few years after Kingsley Hall by Lauren Mosher, who was a friend of R.D. Laing's, was inspired by R.D. Laing, and Mosher wanted to prove that this place, called Soteria Project, could be as successful. Pretty low standard he was setting for himself, but just to show that it could be as successful as the hospital treatment for schizophrenics. And by everyone I've read, the methodology, the experimental methodology he used was very good. He had double binds and so on and so forth. And it was successful in that read the literature, he proved that people who went there, if you read his books, I think the success goes beyond that. But this, I think what's frightened the psychiatric establishment was Moshe was an establishment psychiatrist. He was the head of the schizophrenia division of the National Institute of Mental Health, which is a government organization. And they had all the literature showing that the people who went to Soteria had the same amount or less rehospitalizations after being at Soteria within the next year or two as those who were treated in the hospital. Now, at that time, that was revolutionary. I think now it doesn't really mean that much, but because we know now that these psychiatric drugs, the so-called antipsychotics, are very destructive. But at that time, Moshe was the first to demonstrate that you could reduce the rehospitalization rate. And that was the only criteria he used for his formal studies, rehospitalization. But actually, if you go and read some of the literature, you find that the people who went to Soteria recovered completely, many of them did, whereas the people who went to the regular hospitals became chronic mental patients. But to me, the most interesting thing about that was, as soon as Moshe did that, instead of getting an award, he got fired. The National Institute of Mental Health, I'm using Moshe's word. He said, I was fired. And I discuss that a little in my book. He was fired because he was a threat to the psychiatric establishment to show that schizophrenics, so-called schizophrenics, don't need antipsychotics. And that was a place like Laing's place, non-authoritarian staff and clients, and related as equals. We now have two more of Soteria House that just opened in the last 2 years, one in Alaska and one in Vermont. So there's also been a lot of literature now showing that these kinds of treatments are more successful, that the psychiatric treatments, in fact, are if they're not designed, the effect of them is to create a chronic mental patient. Chronic. One guy who writes on it, a journalist, says, he's more conservative than me. He still talks about this as being an illness. I don't call it an illness. I call it a spiritual crisis. As Laing called it, a potential breakthrough, so-called schizophrenia. But Robert Whitaker does say you have an episodic illness, and the treatment and the medication turn it into a chronic disease.
Now, what we'd like to do is to cover not only the utopian, we'll cover the utopian aspects of the visions that come through in these altered states. But first, the dystopian view. The subtitle of your book is "The Failure of Psychiatry and the Rise of the Mad Pride Movement." So one of the things that strikes, and it's even in the popular press now, is that in the United States is a large percentage of the population that is on psychoactive drugs now, and that has some sort of diagnosis, whether the diagnosis is correct or not. And it seems like that is a mode of social control, and it's deliberate to bring the population into a form of national security state and to take away people's civil liberties.
Mm-hmm.
And that this has been implemented by the psychiatrists. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, well, this, when I first got involved, I went into psychology in 1976, and then by the time I got my PhD, it was 1984. And at that time, I didn't discover it was called the Mental Patients Liberation Movement, until 88. I mean, I never heard of it, and I thought I knew about all those things because I was a anti-establishment, radical, neo-Marxist, whatever I was in college. But I hadn't heard of the mental patient liberation movement until after I graduated. I got my PhD. So that was in 84. I discovered that, and at that time it was a relatively small. It was an interesting thing. The people who were mostly getting drugged in those days were almost all schizophrenics. You didn't have half the population being drugged, and you didn't have half. For example, one figure I like is in 1956 you had approximately 15,000 bipolars, and last year you had 6 million bipolars, so-called bipolars. Yeah. So the whole thing has changed. The whole model has changed. The whole culture has changed. When I got involved, there was a small group of people getting drugged, and they were destroyed by the drug. They were turned. These were people that I believe were visionaries, prophets, and seers who were turned into chronic mental patients by the drugs, and we have more proof of that today. But now there are so-called relatively normal people. They're not considered schizophrenics or bipolar necessarily, although they use the term bipolar pretty loosely now. So you have so many people. There are different reasons. I mean, on one hand, you have more people getting labeled bipolar, but on the other hand, according to Bob Whitaker's research, the drugs that are given people, like children, for example, in school. I mean, this would be a good example of social control. You give a child who's supposedly ADHD, attention deficit disorder, you give that child, you either give him a Ritalin or you give him Prozac or Prozac-type drug. They're referred to as SSRO antidepressants. And what that does is that makes the child manic. I guess it could make adults manic too. But they put him into a manic state. Then he gets a more serious label of bipolar disorder. So that is one of the reasons you have 6 million people. And then another reason you have so many people on the drugs. Now, whether it's designed to, it was certainly designed originally to control schizophrenics when it was introduced in the 50s. They said that. They said, well, here's one quote from one of the psychiatrists who introduced it. This was considered a miracle drug in the 50s when they first introduced it. I forget the name of the psychiatrist, but he said, when the drug works well, it produces an attitude of indifference to the environment, best conveyed by the phrase, couldn't care less. So it was a way to warehouse mental patients in hospitals and without having them complain about it and without having to help them, like Laing said, help them negotiate their way through what could be a rich, beneficial spiritual breakthrough. And John Weir Perry, who you quoted earlier, felt that either consciously or subconsciously, the psychiatrists, when they gave these drugs out, they were trying to suppress the visionaries. John Perry said this in 1980 or something. This was pretty early in the drug. What are we doing to our visionaries? And John was a Jungian, so he had a bit of a different take on it. And what happened, though, was another thing happened was in the late 70s, the American Psychiatric Association was losing business. They were close to going bankrupt because the 60s sensibility had spread to psychology and psychiatry, and people, instead of going for drugs, were going for all kinds of Fritz Perl type encounters, and they were losing money. So that's when they decided to make their alliance with the drug companies. So pretty much by the 80s, psychiatry was the junior partner in the what became what I call, I borrowed the phrase from Peter Bregan. I changed it a little bit. Peter Bregan's a psychiatrist, one of the few who's against the drugs. But he chronicles the rise of what I call the psychiatric pharmaceutical industrial complex. So the psychiatrists were the junior partners in this, and the main motive was to grow and to get as many clients as possible. That was I'm not sure about who was thinking about certainly in schools. They were thinking about the kids who got labeled were, and this is something pointed out by I can't think of Bruce Levine. The kids who got labeled were the more rebellious kids. They got labeled ADHD, attention deficit disorder. Once again, there's always been a prejudice. Those most rebellion is considered a sign of pathology. Now, I don't know if it was actually used in mass for the purpose of making people more quiescent, but that was certainly the effect, because anyone who wasn't quiescent, anyone who wasn't rebellious, was considered mentally ill of some sort or other. And what happened in the 90s was everybody was put on drugs. Psychiatry was making money. The reports, just to give you one indication of the merger of psychiatry and the drug industry, if you read psychiatric journals, the experimental reports that are in the journals, the experiments that were done, the surveys, and these are the most prestigious journals to tell you what drugs to prescribe and how effective they are. They're ghostwritten by employees of the pharmaceutical industry.
For sales.
Yeah. I mean, for example, they massage their data. For example, you had a big thing that's in which a number of people don't know this, but drugs like Prozac cause suicidality in some people, maybe less than 5%, but it's more than the normal population. It makes them suicidal, either in their actions. Okay, well, when they do these, when the employees of the drug companies have like 10 people drop out of their experiments before it begins because they tried to commit suicide, the employees of the drug companies have to put that the people dropped out, but they don't put suicidality. They'll say lability. Labile is a psychiatric term meaning their emotions go up and down. So you have manipulation of the data used in such a way as to sell as many drugs as possible. And Peter Brake, a lot of these school shootings, I only became aware recently that of how phony these school shootings are now. But the drugs themselves cause many people, and this is documented by Dr. Peter Bregan, by a number of people. David Haley, who started off as an establishment psychiatrist in England, documents this in his book called, the title, Let Them Eat Prozac, and makes people just inexplicable. It produces a Jekyll and Hyde effect. But then, okay, that's one thing that they can do with the drugs. But then when the shootings came out in Newtown, and the one before that, I don't know if you did a show on it, but there are a lot of things. Right. Obviously, there's something else going on there in addition to the drugs.
Right.
It's very mysterious, but the official story is fake. So that was something I only discovered recently, and largely, after I did the Alex Jones show, people started calling me,
Right.
telling me that they were getting, voice to skull technology. They were hearing voice, and they were in a group like the group you had on it. You had Magnus Olson.
Right.
These were some of the people from the American counterpart to that group. So I think you referred to, there are people who are they're probably a minority of the people who are labeled schizophrenic, but the estimates range from 100,000 to 350,000. I don't know if you've heard of people whose brains have been invaded by rogue into somebody who has access to technology that is produced by our intelligence agencies in America and in other parts of the world.
Yes, yes. And here, and we could get into the various numbers and the different types of implants and which implants have been activated. But just on that group there, this is the function that the cooperating or compliant psychiatrists are playing. When the patients come to them, either in a judicial setting or an administrative setting, and they say, I'm hearing voices, instead of validating the fact that this may be an unconstitutional intrusion of their privacy into their body, they're labeling them schizophrenic and imprisoning them into the mental health system. And psychiatrists are doing this. Those cooperating psychiatrists are doing this knowingly, so they're becoming the jailers in this new, they call it the transhumanist agenda. I wonder if you could comment on that, this new function that psychiatrists are undertaking.
Well, I don't think there are, at least the psychiatrists I know, it must be a small percent that are actually aware of MK Ultra.
I see.
We know that I don't want to sound like I'm apologizing for them, because the most prestigious psychiatrists were involved in the MK Ultra type experiments.
Right.
From the most prestigious universities. But the thing is, most psychiatrists, as I tell all my friends or clients who are labeled schizophrenic, consider anything outside the norm as pathology, whether it's mysticism or, in one of my books, I talked about the psychiatric treatment of Jesus. At the turn of the 19th and 20th century, there were a whole bunch of books, and they all concluded that Jesus Christ was paranoid schizophrenic, blah, blah, blah. So anything outside the norm is
because he claimed to be, quote, the Son of God. Is that the basis?
Yeah, that's certainly something that I would stress, that anything that's that certainly would be one thing. Thomas Zaz said that there's certain kind of routines or an etiquette you have to observe. Like Zaz, if you pray in a church, it's okay. Doesn't mean you're mentally ill. If you pray in the middle of the street, you're mentally ill. But Zaz put it: if you talk to God, if you talk to God, that's called praying. God talks to you, that's called schizophrenia. So basically, I see them as cultural police. But there's a small percent who are, in the schools you get a larger percent because they're policing rebellion. But outside of the schools, I think it's mostly cultural policing.
Right.
And they're selling people these drugs like Prozac as the placebo, because they don't have anything else to offer, and because they're making millions and billions. The drug companies are making billions of dollars, And the psychiatrists are all involved. 10 years ago, we only have statistics from 2 states. So in Minnesota, we find out 10 years ago, it's probably much higher now. 1/3 of the psychiatrists were getting money, direct money, from the drug companies. And they claimed it didn't. So it's only recently, I would say, of the people that I've met that were schizophrenic, it's only recently that I've come across a few, and that's as a result of going on Alex Jones' show, and they've seen me now, that we're getting these voice to skull type of things. The other people, I believe, have altered states of consciousness that are like Laing was talking about in the 60s. And they'll say things like, Perry points out, they no longer say things like, there's a bomb inside me. They say, like, I hear the dolphins crying or something.
Yeah.
People labeled schizophrenic are, I believe, people who are keenly aware much more keenly aware of their environment. They tend to be more left brain, right brain type of people, and that means they're more inclined to have mystical experience. They're more inclined. We have some studies on this too. They're more inclined to have psychic telepathy, and they're more inclined to have the kinds of experience that get labeled schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia. Now, you can go there to the headquarters in the library of the American Society for Psychical Research. I think it's off of Central Park West. And when I lived in New York, I used to go there quite frequently and look through its journals, and you'll see many studies on telepathy and precognition and all of these non-local attributes of consciousness. They call it psi as a regular function of consciousness. So in fact, it's, in a way, you can say that it's a preferred or a more evolved function of consciousness. Those of us who are in exopolitics know that the more advanced races on other planets communicate with each other telepathically.
Yeah.
And this really goes with what you're saying. In a certain way, you could say that the schizophrenics, or the more psychic or telepathic people, are more evolved than those minds that are more immersed in the time-space linear functions where they need the speed of sound to communicate meaning.
Yeah, it's exactly what I do say, that that people like Jesus, if he came back, would be put in a loony bin, and that there was a chaplain in the 1930s who I quote in the book, named Anton Boyson. And you heard of him?
No.
Oh, okay. And he was a chaplain in a mental hospital. Now, the odd thing was he had himself been a schizophrenic and escaped from chronic schizophrenia, which was very unusual in the 1920s. And he pointed out that there was no difference, that he took people like Jesus. He had 4 or 5 different people he took. George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, was in a deep depression for several years before he came out of it. He had Jesus, who was predicting what was going around, saying the kingdom of God is coming, and it didn't come. And he found that these people, according to him, they were the same as that. They were saying the same kinds of thing as people in mental hospitals. The amazing thing is, it hasn't really changed that much today. But now, according to the guy who wrote the book, Boyson, he lived in the 20s, so he thought they were not genetically as strong, and that's why Jesus was able to come through triumphant, and they weren't. But the way I look at it is, if we take people who are undergoing this same kind of experience, similar kinds of experience that Jesus had, similar in that they have an emotional crisis, they have a vision a messianic vision of harmony and unity, and a nightmarish vision. And I describe this in my book. One of the people in my book is going on to become. I mean, he had. I interviewed him about experience that happened to him in the 80s. He's now a pretty well-known writer, and he's a consultant. He jokes about how psychiatrists come to consult him for their This is on the West Coast, where you find some more open-minded psychiatrists. So these are the messianic, I call them catalysts of messianic transformation potential. And Paul Levy, for example, who's in my book, became that.
Oh, yeah.
And these are people more inclined. Now, if you get these people, capture them when they're going through their experience, which is usually a crisis, a very frightening crisis, and when people say, well, they're having terrible experiences, because in addition to the experiences of the unity and harmony and the paradisical experiences that Mircea Eliade describes when he says, every society has had a vision of all societies a vision of a prehistorical happiness. Anyway, it happens that's part of their vision, but they also have these nightmarish type things that happen to them. I say, well, why wouldn't they have nightmarish things? If they're aware of what's going on in society, if they're more aware of what's going on, if they're, if you're looking at is the cat going to, forget what the experiment was, is the cat dead or alive in a quantum experiment? On the one hand, if we apply that quantum experiment to society as a whole, it's either catastrophe or it's some kind of messianic transformation. At least I don't believe it's possible to have any compromise anymore, any halfway point between the complete destruction of society, which all kinds of scientists are predicting now, whether a result of radioactivity, Fukushima, and more Fukushimas, global warming, environment, but basically environmental factors. I think Martin Rees is one of the more famous British scientists. They asked him, what did he think the chance humanity would make it to the next century? And he said 50-50. So I don't believe that we can continue in the same way and survive, nor, the liberal solution, or the kind of moderate, what used to seem to be the more reasonable solution is, my parents used to say this to me when I was 16 and carrying my flag and saying revolution. You have to learn to compromise, blah, blah, blah. Things only, you don't get anything done unless, no progress is not made unless there's compromise. I believe that the compromise is no longer, it's no longer an option. Compromise is leading to catastrophe. The antidote to catastrophe is to diffuse the messianic, what I call the messianic utopian vision, imaginary we could call it, a messianic utopian imaginary throughout society. That hasn't happened yet. I mean, we have a new age. My hope was that was going to happen with the Mad Pride movement, once it went from mental patients' liberation to Mad Pride. And it started to happen, but then they retreated.
Now, this is where exopolitics and the dimensional ecology may come in, because that science or that discipline provides some of the beginnings of some objective evidence that there are dimensions beyond our time-space hologram, and we exist in a dimensional ecology of intelligences that interact with our dimension. In fact, some thought has it that schizophrenia is just that those individuals are tuned into those other spheres in ways that people, the normal person in our sphere, isn't aware of the dimensional ecology that is going on, and they are, because of brain chemistry or some other portal, they are talking to it.
Yeah.
And that it's the dimensional ecology's intervention, be it extraterrestrial, interdimensional, spiritual, there are all these different categories.
Yeah.
And that's where I found your book. Here, Perry's quote: almost universally within acute psychosis lies the messianic vision of a new world order based on equality and harmony, tolerance and love. Because that's the message that comes from the positive side of the dimensional ecology, in the same way that there is a negative side. There's a demonic side to the dimensional ecology. And we find it when we study extraterrestrial contactees, or we study people that have had multidimensional experiences and spoken to entities, that very often they're tasked with a messianic mission. We want you to go out and tell people about this. And then these people spend the rest of their lives going out and saying, I went to Venus, and Venus is wonderful, and this is how you've got to do it. And I mean, that's just one example. But there's all sorts of other examples. And that's part of the leavening, which is happening now. And if you look at the public opinion polls, you're up to 55% that of the population believes in that reality.
I read that book.
Yeah. So I really think that in a way the Mad Pride movement is a part of the multidimensional liberation movement, and that is trying to say, wait, we're more than just the time-space dimension here. There's multidimensionals. They come in dreams. They can come in all sorts of formats. They can be little fairies. They can be ghosts. They can be all sorts of things. And you can go, you can look at the parapsychological literature, and there's replicable stuff there. And I'm just wondering, is that something that makes sense to you? That would be, I know you're saying that you were disappointed in Mad Pride, but doesn't the multi-dimensional world and its movements seem like where this goes? I'm kind of asking you that.
Yeah, well, I was disappointed in Mad Pride because the founders of it, after they founded it, seemed to retreated and took a more conservative position.
Yeah.
The first position was, we have something that makes us different, better, and this is what leads us, not better, but it's something we can distinctive and contribute. And then as they wanted to reach more people, they seemed to dilute that message. It didn't go off in that way. So I wanted to try to get people together to restart that movement. Now, how that movement, how I discovered, I didn't even know anything about exopolitics until 3 months ago, or UFOs. I turned on YouTube. I listened to you interviewing Lauren Moret.
Oh yeah.
Said this is very, very, very scary. And the worse things got, the worse, more depressed I got, and I thought, what is we need some, we need some outside intervention here.
Right.
I don't think we don't have enough time. I mean, I could try to, without humanity doesn't have enough time to save ourselves before the sociopaths running the society destroy us. So
Right.
I was hopeful. I started listening. I was less interested in these Greys who were part of someone, maybe it was you, came up with the military industrial extraterrestrial complex, than the people that didn't weren't involved with the Greys. And the idea that you had, I don't think it was your idea, but you spoke of it, of the idea of it came from the Urantia book.
Oh yeah, sure.
There being a what do you call it when you have tuberculosis and you want to quarantine.
Yeah, quarantine.
Quarantine and the quarantine ending. Now I hadn't heard that before, but that was, I must say, it's an encouraging idea.
Yeah.
Because really, if just looking at the way things look now, it doesn't. Many people have become cynical because it's just so overwhelming. Everywhere you look, there's another problem. So, if there were, in fact, not just people, human beings on the planet Earth, but a wider group that would intervene. But I don't know what scenario. I haven't read your new book because it's not out yet.
Right. Yeah. It just coming. It's called The Dimensional Ecology of the Omniverse.
Yeah.
And if you go to dimensionalecology.com, I'll just put it in your chat. That'll give you more dimensionalecology.com. Yeah. But that i.e. that says that we're right at the stage where some people call it ascension, that is moving from what's called the third density to the fourth density. But functionally, what it is where humanity opens itself up to the dimensional ecology more. So we have more input. This isn't extraterrestrials walking up down the sideway because down the sidewalk, because this is much more. It can happen in dreams.
Yeah.
It can happen in all sorts of formats, but it's where society allows it and encourages it and tolerates it. And this is where I think your book is so useful, because it shows how the psychiatric establishment has, when you say it's cut off inspiration and vision, it's cut off humanity from the dimensional ecology.
Yeah.
Functionally speaking, because that's where inspiration and vision come. Bohr got the idea of the atom from a dream, because that's how intelligence that is in other dimensions, when we're in the dream state, that we go to another sort of etheric dimension, we have interactions there, and that's how new information is brought into our dimensions, and those aren't figurative operations or interactions. Those are literal and actual and scientific interactions.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think that your book is so seminal, because it comes out of the psychiatric and really opens it up and saying, look, we have to open ourselves up to the multidimensional experience. I just wanted to give you that feedback. What are your feelings about that, about what I just shared with you?
Well, yeah, I hope that indeed does happen. My thought was that transformation, and I use the example in the book, at least among human beings, will happen or could happen if they become gripped by a messianic or utopian vision. You can't even use the word messianic in certain circles, but it's easily misunderstood. And utopian, when I say messianic, I mean multi-dimensional, but I mean utopian with that multi-dimensional. In Sri Aurobindo's, are you familiar with Aurobindo?
I am, but tell us more.
In his great poem, Savitri, a poem about love and death and the conquest of physical mortality, which was one of Aurobindo's themes. He was a rare kind of Indian neo-Hindu philosopher. I say neo-Hindu because he was so steeped in the Upanishads and the Vedas, but his vision in many ways was different. In some ways, it was more like the original Christian vision, because he believed in the kingdom of God on earth. And when he spoke of it, he spoke of the kingdom of heaven on earth, the kingdom of God on earth, or the divine life on earth. I don't know what you could say. I don't know what this. I don't think there's a comparable Hindu phrase that evokes that sense. If you could get that idea into the collective imagination of people, and that idea in the poem, for example, the main death is the person that the heroine of the poem's name is Savitri, and she has a dialogue with death because her soulmate, who she meets I'm using a contemporary term,
Right.
but he died in 1950, Aurobindo, but Sri Aurobindo, but it's basically she meets her soulmate and then discovers that he's going to die in a year. She's told this by a seer, but she says once she's made her pledge, she doesn't take back. And then we've learned elsewhere that Savitri is actually an emanation of the divine that's come down to earth to save earth. And so at first she thinks, first she doesn't know how she's going to handle it. Then she thinks her task is just to save her lover, her spouse, from death, to bring him back from the land of the dead. And she gets in this polemic with death. And the interesting thing is, death is saying all of the things that the seers of many other traditions say. Well, for example, leave the earth behind. The earth is not the place where salvation takes place. The Hindus put it, the highest liberation, moksha, is when you leave the material world, which is pure illusion, and in what happened in Christianity, they had you go to heaven after you die. The original vision, I think most historians would agree, was the kingdom of heaven on earth, a transformation of earth, but that's not the way it's usually interpreted. So what death says, apart from speaking, is making a strong, intelligent arguments for an otherworldly salvation, to which Savitri always replies over and over again, because Aurobindo was committed to the divine life on earth. Death always speaks in the name of the law. The law has been made, the law has been written, it can't be changed. If I put a passage, a book here, and the thing is, she's not, nor was Aurobindo, and scientists, particularly quantum mechanics, say that laws evolve now. So there's no reason to think that that's part of the Messianic vision. We do not have to be limited by or what we consider to be the laws of nature, and these laws reflect our lack of spiritual development. As we're more highly developed spiritually, the so-called laws or the regularities or what Rupert Sheldrake calls the habits of nature will change. They will not stand in the way. And both metaphorically and literally in this poem, can I read a little bit of it?
Please do.
Because I'm not as eloquent as, to put it mildly, I can't, this is a 700-page poem. I'm just quoting one little piece to give you an idea. I saw them cross the twilight of an age, the sun-eyed children of a marvelous dawn, the great creators with wide brows of calm, the massive barrier breakers of the world and wrestlers with destiny, the messengers of the incommunicable, the architects of immortality. Into the fallen human sphere they came, faces that wore the immortal's glory still, voices that commune still with the thoughts of God, bodies made beautiful by the Spirit's light, carrying the magic word, the mystic fire, carrying the Dionysian cup of joy, approaching eyes of a diviner man, lips chanting an unknown anthem of the soul, feet echoing in the corridors of time, high priests of wisdom, sweetness, might, and bliss, discoverers of beauty's sunlit ways, and swimmers of love's laughing fiery floods, and dancers within rapture's golden doors. Their tread one day shall change the suffering earth and justify the light and justify the light on nature's face. That's one quote from Aurobindo. Throughout the poem, he contrasts this vision, and the avatar is a female. There is no, in the Hindu tradition, there are no female avatars, but this was Aurobindo's vision. And his partner, who was not his sexual partner, but a spiritual partner, was a French woman, Mira Richard, and he believed that she was an avatar of sort. I guess an avatar, but at any rate, this is his vision of the union of male and female. For one thing, often he talks the phrase that's used over again, the marriage of the eternal bridegroom and the eternal bride. So she manages, the hero in the poem, to win death, to defeat death through her polemics, and he admits defeat, and he's about to grant her her union with her soulmate, to return him from the dead. Satvayan is, I guess, probably mispronouncing his name, but she's told just for her and him alone, and she says she doesn't want it for her and him alone. Their task is to bring salvation to all human beings, not just for her and him alone, so that this immortality will be the heritage of all human beings. She finally prevails. There's a phrase too, I probably couldn't find it, when she talks about that, it came to bring the sunlight down to all human beings. Hindus speak of the eternal dawn. Anyway, these things that we take for granted, death, disease, all those things were not considered laws of nature from the perspective of a Hindu or neo-Hindu seer, nor are they considered laws of nature, I think, from the perspective of many scientists who are masters of quantum physics. And so I think that that's perhaps the commonality in terms of the mad people who have these mad visions are much more open, not only to a utopian vision, but to utopian vision that transgresses the so-called laws of nature, which I think is also something you find in these tridimensional. You gave examples of telepathy being common. I presume, I don't know. You haven't said, and I haven't really found much discussed, and I've only read a few books so far, but I haven't found anything discussed. How long, various uh, extraterrestrial beings live, whether they go
Right.
to the.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's,
They have. I cover some of that in this forthcoming book. There's some passages on the exophenotypology of of the various ET races, but let me ask you this: in terms of the future, I know that we're in a kind of we're in days now where they can be fairly dark, our days.
yeah, yeah.
And but are you a long range optimist or a long range pessimist? Where do you find yourself?
Well, back when I wrote my first published essay, I used the term which I had found in some book uh, uh, about 19th century about the Romantic poet. So at that time, I called myself a cosmic optimist. So the
Right,
thing the thing that bothers me is always how long. How long? That's how long is it? Since I do believe in God, and I was raised as an atheist or an agnostic, so I didn't get it from my family belief in God, and believe in God meaning that the transcendence will has is the happiness of all creatures. Um, I asked myself how long is it, because we're not supposed to ask these questions. I suppose we're supposed to just carry on, which is all we get. I don't know if you have an answer to that question. I mean, since metaphysically I believe that I'm an optimist, since it has to prevail ultimately. How long is the question, though?
right. Which are and and this is a process which is occurring on this particular planet.
Yeah,
That is, it's just as opposed to uh, other planets and other intelligent civilizations in other galaxies of this universe, and there are multiple universes in our multiverse. So we're we're just facing one little transitional time
yeah.
on this planet now.
Many of the people I read or I've seen on TV, or I mean on YouTube,
Yeah.
Camelot, say that this is the worst planet. One of the worst, anyway.
Well, it depends on on one's perspective, because from a different perspective, as a reincarnational venue, there's a lot of learning that says that the souls who are privileged enough to incarnate here uh, learn to live on hope alone and have such rugged lives
Yeah,
that you get a lot of soul development in a small amount of time.
yeah,
So we are known, souls who graduate from Earth. It's like, it's like the Cambridge or the Harvard or the, I'm just using,
yeah,
so it just it depends on which way you're looking at it, because in the end, one of the conclusions that I reach in the dimensional ecology of the omniverse is that this appears to be a our waking our waking reality, a 3D waking reality, appears to be a designed virtual experience for soul development. It's
yeah.
like an advanced carnival ride, and they said, "Oh,
Uh,
well, guess what? You want a life on Earth.
uh,
You're number one." So it's perspectives happen, and perhaps leading a life of riches and fame on this planet, and you go into the literature on near death experiences, which we go into a bit in the book. It's very very interesting, that whole literature. You find out that riches and wealth are not all that they're uh, that they might be an impediment to soul development, number one. and that one of the prime things that you can gain is knowledge, because it's one of the few things that you can take with you. You can't
Yeah.
take riches with you.
But what I've heard so many people say that on other planets they're not destroying their ecosystem. They don't have wars all the time.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, 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 no. This is an afflicted planet, no
Yeah.
doubt.
Hmm.
Um, and we're from what I understand it is that we this zone is a kind of a targeted zone. We had a rebellion here. We've had all out galactic war. And now we've had an attempted takeover by hostile hyperdimensional races in terms of the Draco reptilians and the Orion Greys.
Yeah.
Now, even in the midst of that, uh, uh, if you look at, say, a Urantia perspective of it, where all the avatars come. Avatars love to come here. Why? Because they can be avatars here, because
Yeah.
they can be gurus here. This is where they get their chops. And this is where we get our chops as souls. So
Yeah.
you just have to, it's like you turn it around and you look at it from a different place.
So you're not. You would call yourself an optimist too, then, right?
Oh, I am so optimistic that people say, Alfred, you're just looking at the world through rose-colored glasses.
Yeah, I think I heard you say that. Yeah.
No, no, I am. My position is that, and this is a hypothesis, and it could be percentage right or percentage wrong, that by, some further, 2025, be it 2025, 2050, we are on a positive timeline,
Yeah.
and we are on our way toward landing what we could call heaven on earth in
Yeah.
an objective way. And if you look at it, we have all the technologies for landing heaven on earth, where we can create everybody's a millionaire.
Yeah.
We maximize our creative potential. We redefine money so it's no longer in scarcity, and it's free. If money becomes a public utility like
Yeah.
water or electricity,
Yeah.
and it's a completely different concept. And so that we could flip this planet into a paradise planet very easily.
And people wouldn't have to be subject to death.
Yeah, yeah. And so right now is kind of the crucial transition time, because we're fighting against, well, I call it the exploitative Illuminati, Anunnaki Illuminati hierarchies, these
Yeah.
kind of monarchical forms which come from bloodlines from the past, uh, playing zero sum games. I win, you lose, rather
Right.
than getting into win win. And
Yeah.
so it's the question of how we flip that. And I think that once we get beyond these four tetra eclipses, the four blood moons of 2014, 2015, beyond 2016 to 2017 will be better sailing.
Yeah.
So these are kind of rough, very rough navigational markers that I think by the time we're in 2020, 2025, we'll be toward landing the beginnings of heaven on on earth, because we've got everything there.
Or do you think that the various extraterrestrials will play a role in it, or
Oh,
as
sure, sure.
extraterrestrial?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
And
there's no longer the non-intervention rule.
well, see, I think it's better to call them interdimensionals or hyperdimensionals, because they're coming to us in our dreams. They're intervening in our dreams every
Oh,
night. You see, it's a much more dimensional and interdimensional process rather
yeah,
than they showed up in Central Park, or whatever. It's not this physical 3D, you know, 1950s sci-fi movie.
yeah,
It's a much more interdimensional thing, and we're all expanding and we're elevating, and that's how the transition, or flipping our society from a hierarchical one to a networking one that's expansive and not repressive, is going to work. And
yeah,
once we have society supporting the visions rather than repressing them, society will improve.
yeah. And how do you think that is going to happen? It's a small group at this point, right? The
You mean
so political group. Yeah.
on the other side, on the
No, I meant here human beings that are. Yeah.
in that are it's a small group of human beings that are in power, or
But
that
politics.
oh oh well, I think that if one looks at the public opinion polls,
Oh, the public opinion polls, sure.
they're very expansive, and that humans have a very expansive values, and that once one starts to reward the expansive side of human beings and reward their better angels, then
Yeah,
they'll start moving that way. The problem is that for eons, uh, we've had these hierarchical punishing gods, hierarchical punishing kings, hierarchical punishing parents,
yeah,
hierarchical punishing institutions, and so that's that whole thing. And the psychiatrists have become part of the hierarchical punishing institutions from the past, and their tools of punishment have been the drugs, and
yeah,
they're saying, well, this guy's got to get committed or something, you know. So we're in a transition now. That whole infrastructure is starting to fall apart. I
yeah,
know we could talk about some cases that we had recently in Brussels where there was an attempted psychiatric commitment of an anti-transhumanist agenda activist there, and it didn't work.
really.
Yeah.
Huh.
So it's starting to the pendulum's starting to shift.
Yeah. Well, they got away with it. They put that the little girl, I forget her name,
Yeah.
in the Cambridge, Boston area, was
Yeah.
taken away from her parents because they didn't want her. She was sick. Yeah,
Yeah.
there was that story. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
No. The U.S. as the U.S. would appear, in my judgment, as a person who's a U.S. citizen but also a dual national and located outside of the U.S., as in
mhm,
real trouble as far as its social fabric and its mental hygiene.
yeah.
Well, I've taken more of your time. Please, what 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 words would you like to leave our viewing audience? What thoughts would you like to leave our viewing audience with? Today we're at March 25th, 2014. We've been talking about a lot of deep issues. This is an historical transition. What words would you like to leave us with?
Um, yeah, well, I want to say, obviously, some people watching this will have been labeled schizophrenic and bipolar,
Yeah,
and the drugs that they give them, they call them medication, are really will destroy their body and their soul. I mean, they could go to my website and look at the variety of books on the topic. And
Sure.
my book is specifically on. It goes into that, but my book is specifically on the Mad Pride movement. People have been resisting this, but these drugs they're not going to make what R.D. Laing said, that schizophrenia was a spiritual breakdown, but it was not just a breakdown. It was also a potential breakthrough. And this is like heresy now. No, but hardly anyone takes it seriously. But I want people to know that these experiences, they can't necessarily depend upon a psychiatrist, because it's almost impossible to find one. And that if they can make it with friends on their own, one thing they have to do is stay away from those drugs that psychiatrists are pushing, particularly drugs that are called Now, you can't get off these drugs overnight, because you develop a dependence on them, and they cause, if you get off them, you'll have withdrawal symptoms, but the psychiatrists won't say they're withdrawal symptoms. They'll say your illness is coming back. And the ironic thing is they have managed to drill it into the public consciousness that the social crisis with mental patients is because that for some mysterious reason they don't want to take their medication. And
Right.
they don't want to take their medication because their medication is destroying their brain and their mind and their soul, and they intuitively feel that and know it. And the thing to do is not to take it, to get off it slowly. So that's one thing I want to tell them. And I do want to start a new organization, and so that I would have for people. There's both of the organizations that exist are good. One is called Icarus Project. The other is called Mind Freedom. But they both become more conservative in the sense that they don't go out and say, well, take your vision seriously. I did that. I had, there was someone who wrote on, the first so-called schizophrenic I met. This was in 1970. I was in college. She came up to me and told me she was the mother of the new Messianic age. Now, wow, that's a good thing. I mean, that's a
Yes,
good thing.
it is.
To think that. Now they'll say, well, what about narcissism and this and that and so on. Paul Levy, who now runs the group and has written books, and he agrees with me. Don't worry so much about the narcissism. To think you're the mother of the new Messianic age, you're on to something if you feel that. But you can't do it alone. People like that have to do it with other people. When I read this woman on one of the Icarus Projects forum wrote, I feel that Jesus wants me to do something to save the planet. And I know it's a sickness, but is there anything so bad about it? So I wrote her, I'm a psychologist, and I think you're right. I think Jesus does want you to do something to save the planet. I couldn't convince her I was a psychologist. She thought I was another mental page.
I see.
It's so unusual. Eventually I did, but by then she was on the drug. It was too late, but other people can be saved. But I mean, basically, I said to her that, yes, and that's what I want to say to other people too. I've said this to other people. They believe that what you say is right. In a way, you are meant to save the planet. Jesus does have a plan for you. And then when I said that to her, though, I didn't convince her. She sent me all this stuff, and it was, Alfred, it was not a lot of fundamentalist BS, which is what I thought it might be, because, I don't know where she got it, because she went to a fundamentalist church, but it was like a pagan version or a Celtic version of Christianity, a non-dual, the spirit of Jesus, his cosmic Christ is throughout the land. It was her own words. I'd have to find it, but we don't have time for it. But so you get enough people like that, and you create a messianic wing. I do the exact opposite. I want a group to do the exact opposite of the. There's so much pressure that even people who started these groups, like the Icarus Project and Mind Freedom, say, "Well, we don't want to be too." They'll think we're crazy. I don't care if they think you're crazy. It's more important we get this message out to more people. Your visions are important visions. They have to do with the transformation that's taking place on the planet. And you got to get off the drugs, because if you stay on the drugs, they will suppress those visions. And isn't it ironical that the people that the psychiatric establishment thinks and has thought for years were the mentally sickest people on the planet were really the most spiritually advanced?
Exactly, exactly. Where can people get in touch with you?
Well, they can call my phone number or my phone or go on my website.
Website. Your website is
www.seth, S-E-T-H, there are two H's, Seth H. Farber, Farber.com. And that has all my books, and it could take them to my various books. Now, I also, talk to people for free. I mean, not all the time, but at least once, just to let them know that there is an alternative, and that they are, I believe, as Laing said in The Politics of Experience, they are part of the spiritual vanguard. And as Laing said, I have to quote Laing again, Christopher Columbus and all those explorers, they were lost. That's what happens when you go out there on your own and you explore your vision. You get lost. The cure for it is not to stay at home. The cure for it is not to take drugs. Joseph Campbell said that the schizophrenic and the mystic are swimming in the same ocean, but the schizophrenic is drowning and the mystic is swimming. Well, that's only because no one taught the schizophrenic to swim. All that needs to happen is they need to learn to swim, which is not very hard to do.
Right.
Really. It means becoming familiar with the environment. It means reading people like Sri Aurobindo. If you can't read Sri Aurobindo, reading, I don't know, which would you say are the best books to read on exopolitics?
Well, there's a whole library. I'm partial to my own book, which is Exopolitics, Politics, Government, and Law in the Universe.
That's not something that people who have a high school education, though.
Yeah, no, they can. It's written very, very simply.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we have kids in our Mars, in our Exopolitics Mars Facebook group that are 11 years old, and they are at the head of the class. These are new generations of crystal kids that are coming in. They have advanced auras. They have advanced chakra systems. Their DNA is more advanced than ours. We're the old pioneers. We're the early indigos.
And how'd you find them?
I'm sorry?
How'd you find these kids?
No, we just open up and you're welcome to join on Facebook.
Oh.
We opened up our Exopolitics Mars group, and so people join.
Oh, I see. So when you say kids, you mean 20s or not 10-year-olds?
No. This is an 11-year-old.
11. Oh, and they join.
And he is the most advanced, one of the most advanced people in this group. So nature is bringing in the more advanced souls now who are accelerating us.
Yeah.
So
phone number. I could give my phone number.
Oh yeah, sure, please.
And 212. I'll give my voicemail.
Sure.
507288.
Yeah, you kind of broke up there. Could you say it again?
212-560-7288.
Good. And we will put your website and your phone number on here so that people will be able to see it. Well, I think that we've come to the end of this segment. I must say this has been a very powerful program, and we want to thank you for taking time to be with us. And we hope that in the future, as as the evolution of our society develops, you'll be able to come back and bring your insights to our viewers once more.
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed being here.
So, certainly.